Okay, we're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. I am back.
Yay! Yay! My great relief.
I had a big trip to France and Switzerland, and it was awesome. And I am not going to tell you anything about it on the air. So I don't know. You never know. Little snippets of it may start sneaking in various points because I use basically everything I've ever experienced in the show. But today we're talking about Ancestry. This is a topic that was suggested by Morgan, so thank you, Morgan. This is a really fun topic. I guess I think that Ancestry is something that is often given a lot of importance. And in fact, I think that there is a great deal, across genre, there is a great deal of adopting ancestry as a really important factor is quite common across genre. And I think often it's not questioned enough. Like how we give ancestry importance in our stories is important, as well as whether we're giving, in science fiction, yeah, it's there too.
Yeah,
it's there too. I mean, you've got things like, well, off the top of my head, Dune, where, you know, like you have these whole clans of people, and all the people in this clan are good, and all the people in this clan are evil, and but I mean, but you know what I'm saying.
Wow. Yeah.
I think this is related to, though it is not congruent with, the question of whether people are true to type in genre. And that is another type of problem that, you know, what you get is, I am this way because I am a member of this group, right? That's what I mean by running true to type. I am an elf, and therefore I blah, 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 right?
Racial essentialism.
Right, exactly. I was actually just going to say that phrase, racial essentialism. That is exactly what we deal with a lot of times. But everybody who is born into a community has a relationship to the expectations that are put on them by that community. And so that's one of the things that I work on in my work. But I mean, so ancestry is not determinative, right? But it does have a lot to do with how we're perceived by other people when they know our ancestry, whether they are able to recognize it visually or whether they are acquainted with it in some other way. Certainly in the book that I'm reading, there are a lot of social groups that are determined by birth. And within the nobility, there are the 12 great families, and the 12 great families are incredibly inbred. So they are all basically congruent with one another. And yet, people put a lot of stock in which family you ostensibly belong to and where your ancestry goes. And in particular, the family that's called the first family is the one that has the most direct descendants from the person who established their society as they know it, the great global Finn. And so that is why they have claimed the title of the first family. And it's not a huge thing for them, but it is definitely a point of pride for them. And so it's, you know, I mean, effectively, genetically, if you looked at it, it would probably be pretty meaningless. You'd probably find that Gerbil Finn's DNA was pretty much spread through the nobility, and everybody has a bit of it, and you know. But so that it's almost like the narrative of their ancestry is more important than the actual facts of their ancestry, which should be surprising to no one, I think.
Yeah.
So who else
Sorry?
is getting an echo when I talk?
Uh-oh.
I am, but
Oh,
just plow through and then mute maybe? I don't know.
okay. All right. So who tracks family ancestry? People who have people whose families have power or money, I think. Is that the case? Do you think that they are more likely to track their family ancestry than people who don't have power or money, whose families don't have power or money? Does that make sense?
Well, sure.
I disagree, actually. So I don't know how many of us in this conversation are Americans. Are all of us Americans?
I think we're all Americans, yeah.
Today.
Yeah.
Today, right.
So for my Japanese side, pre coming to the U.S., everybody is in the family registry, so there's no need to do the genealogy work because it's been done officially.
Mm-hmm.
And in the U.S., the people who are interested in genealogy are just sort of hobbyists. But I think that as Americans, we lose sight of the fact that in a lot of other places, your ancestry isn't just carried within your family. Everybody else that you grew up around knows your ancestry too.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that we get this idea that it's a rarefied thing, or we encounter ancestry as a thing of pedigrees, and we get this perception that it's a thing for power, but it's also around the world. It's also a thing of oppression. So I don't think that it's I don't think that you can draw that line.
Yeah, you're right. And I'm going to contradict myself too, because while you were talking, I remembered there's also that in religious ancestry that has to be tracked, particularly for Jews. I mean, Reform says, it doesn't matter which parent it is, but if your mother was Jewish, you're Jewish. So it's good to know who your mother is, who your mother's mother is, who your grandmother's mother is, so that you can say, yeah, that all the way back to Sarah. And I don't know anybody who can trace that far back, but that makes ancestry important, at least down the.
In fact, there was somebody at my kid's school who had like special status because he had some lineage connection back to a very key Jewish figure. And he mentioned that at one point, and I thought, never heard of that before, but I'm not Jewish, so I don't know these things. But
there are
what I'm thinking of is the Mormons.
There are rabbinic dynasties in Jewish tradition. So
rabbinic dynasties.
You're like the great grandson of a famous rabbi or whatever. Not only are you expected to be a rabbi, you're expected to be like, a guru, essentially, right?
Which is absurd. I mean, it might be true, but it's absurd.
Speaking of absurd, I wanted to talk about the Masmer problem in Judaism, which is it's in Deuteronomy that says a Masmer, which I'll define in a minute, shall not enter the congregation of the Lord even to his 10th generation. He shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord. And the rabbis understand a Masmer to be the child of either an incestuous or adulterous relationship. And the idea is they have to track such offspring for 10 generations and prevent them from being part of the Jewish community. So it's like if your 9th generation ancestor, came out of an adulterous relationship, technically, not only are you not Jewish, but your kids can't be Jewish, and the next your grandkids could be Jewish. But, this is an inherited problem that goes for 10 generations.
Wow.
Who the heck tracks that anyway, right? So,
somebody is, right? Or at least they used to.
Yeah.
Presumably.
You say who tracks that anyway, but that's exactly the sort of thing that leads to Dalits, and that's what leads to the outcast group in Japan, and it's actually quite common around the world for a a group to be designated the outsider because of their ancestry.
Yeah, I was
I wonder.
well, I was saying, I put in the chat bar, it's I think that's sort of like the American genealogy is hobbyist. The fact that I think many Americans don't necessarily care or trace back their ancestry that far, although I mean obviously there are exceptions, Daughters of the Revolution, whatever. But I think it's our sort of it's that general American idea that like you said, pedigree being something you encounter like, you know, British lords or something. I think that's why it ends up in genre kind of the way it does, where you have like this very sort of rarefied set of people, nobility usually only, tracing back their lineage, and everybody else is just unwashed peasants. And I think that just sort of comes from our American attitude to it, and without realizing that it's very different in other places of the world. And I think if we knew that, we might be able to put it in genre in better, more significant ways.
Well, it's interesting because there are a couple things going on here. Before we move on to that question, I want to just mention the Mormons because they have one of the biggest ancestry registers in the world in Salt Lake City. And there are aspects of their religion that lead them to find it very, very important to track all of their ancestors. And one of those reasons is that you can posthumously baptize people and send them to heaven, which, you know, we're not going to talk about that specific belief, but it is one of the motivations behind tracking all your ancestors, because you want to make sure that all of your ancestors end up in heaven, whatever. But there are lots and lots of reasons, and I thought it should be mentioned sort of in connection with what we were talking about with the way that Jewish people track their ancestry and such. Because it is obviously a different religious kind of way to track your ancestry. Anyway, so going back to what Che was just saying, I think it ends up in genre a ton. And I think that there's this way in which a lot of American writers will invest the idea of ancestry with kind of magic, that blood equals truth, or, you know, that ancestry is somehow determinative. I think this is it's a widespread idea, and I think it's definitely present even in Americans. And
I don't think that this is because we're Americans. I think it's because we're coming from a whole Western legacy of myth that was designed to support the divine right of kings, and we just go along with it unquestioningly.
Yep.
And it's kind of so in the US we have two different competing narratives. We have the you know, inherited nobility narrative, and then we have Alexander Hamilton on the other end. Mm-hmm. The myth of this self-made man, and both of them are serious distortions of what actually happens.
Yep.
Everywhere.
Yeah, but I mean, it's an interesting dichotomy. But I do think that the divine right of kings is something that you can trace in a lot of genre. I mean, a lot. And in some ways, you know, this is the second time I've not talked about my own world, but I do think that it's one of the things that I was trying to work against when I was initially constructing this world, because when I first came up with it, I was 13 years old, and it was a thing where, you know, kings had been cast down and would have to find their way back up again. And it was definitely one of these things where, you know, you had this idea of the right of kings, that, hey, they should have been cast down and they are going to have to find their way back up again. But then as the idea matured over time, I was like, well, that doesn't make any sense, because that, you know, that's, I don't see how that would happen in the real world. It's a very common narrative, right? Kings cast down, having to come back up, but it's not at all. I don't know. You'd have to work really hard to make it plausible in a real world scenario.
So this is the myth of the American South, though.
Well, sure. In some ways.
That's the essence.
Elaborate.
The South will rise again.
How?
Well, I think it also comes to like, under what circumstances do you sort of abandon your ancestry and remake yourself?
Well, there are other. I mean, there are plenty of narratives out there about the nature of family and finding your family outside of your direct blood lineage because of abuse or any number of other factors which make you either isolated or needing to be isolated from the things that you've always been told are going to be important for in terms of family. I just watched the movie Shine on the plane, and wow, you know, nothing is as important as family. Oh boy.
If your ancestry puts you in a position that you do not wish to be in, if your ancestry says, well, you are, you know, your father was a logger, and your father's father was a logger, your whole family is loggers, and you don't want to be a logger, but society, whatever, society puts you upon you this expectation that that is what you are supposed to be. That's when you step away from your family and your ancestry. And if it's a strong enough expectation, you might choose to try to hide that, to say, no, that's not my family.
Right.
So that it might be less difficult for you to not be a logger or whatever, but not necessarily easier to become something else because you're not part of that family, that ancestry.
Well, and that kind of stuff, when you have a family profession, or if you have a family way of life, because I mean, I think talking about loggers is one thing, but we have much more, well, I mean, we can go into that in a minute, but there's also a social construction of support for a particular path within your community and your family. If you have, a family full of loggers, or a family full of, I mean, I see this discussed. I see this discussed in discussions of poverty, for example, and people who have grown up outside of poverty have a lot of social constructs that allow them to follow a particular path, and a lot of that stuff is just absent if you are not already in that social media, right? And which is why social mobility is so difficult, because there isn't a lot of social support for changing, basically for upward mobility in general. There are, the things you have to know how to say, the things that you have to know to do, the people that you need to have as your contacts to reach out to in order to follow this path, right?
So the other part of this is that we also this is why Austin works so well and why everybody's fascinated, because it's about going the other way. It's about people who don't have the context to go from having certain class expectations and being unable to afford their class expectations, which I'm going to submit is exactly why Austin is so beloved by so many academics.
Say that again, Kat?
Why Austin is so beloved by academics. And, there's class expectations, and then there's the budget to actually fulfill them.
Ah, okay.
So it goes both ways.
Yeah.
suddenly you have a budget or access and you don't have the acculturation. The other thing I was going to say is that this is also why there's such a long lineage of people reading texts and talking about queering the text, because the whole family expectations, this is the way we know how to do it, and all of a sudden you are doing a thing that is outside those bounds, is a strong part of the queer narrative of, you know, you not only is your family loggers, but they're all heterosexual.
Yeah, yeah.
And now you I don't know whether you want to be a gay lumberjack or whether you want to be gay in somewhere else, but you know, it's that same
because the expectation is that, or I think has been, and it lingers, that if you're gay, you're not going to have children, so you're not going to have grandchildren, you're not going to have great grandchildren, and that's the lineage ends with you, and that expectation is,
well, I mean, it has to do with how lineage is defined too.
yeah.
But I'm glad you brought it up, Kat, because that is an interesting issue.
I actually have actually working on that in one of my stories, to make it, to think of a system that will make it possible to continue a family line, and still account for putting someone, still account for gay members of that line without breaking it. And it's not easy because it's not easy.
Well, it's interesting. So one of the questions that comes up in this context is, how do we define ancestry, and how, you know, is it a DNA thing necessarily? I mean, in a lot of cases it is. But I'm
that only helps you if you have DNA, if you have the concept, if you're technologically advanced to.
Well, but no, I mean, no, because like
DNA,
blood,
yeah,
call it blood, and it's been in our discussion of ancestry for like ever, right?
Well, I'd like to talk about adoption.
Sure.
And how it's like largely mishandled. You know, like there was this egregious example of the, in many ways, bad movie, Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull, where he had a biological child who was raised by Marion, the mother, and a father who married Marion and was the father, right? Indiana Jones was the birth father. And the father conveniently died like a year before the movie takes place, and like the kid, who's now an adult, is suddenly calling Indiana Jones dad by the end of the film. And with this whole idea that, you know, screw the guy who raised him, right? You know, he doesn't have the same DNA. Yeah. And that's an extreme example, but it's all over the genre. Like the problematic, you know, I'm going to have to write this, I think, because I would love to see something in which, you know, an adopted child, like their biological heritage is irrelevant for the story, and they take on the mantle of whatever, you know, their ancestry demands of their adoptive family. That would be
okay. So I'm gonna come up with, I want to give you two interesting examples that are sort of relevant to this. One is the Japanese practice that Kat may know more about than I do, of when you have only a daughter, adopting her husband into the family line, so that that person can carry on businesses or whatever. The other one is that we were just at the Chateau de Pau, where Henry IV used to live. And Henry IV was notorious for being incredibly promiscuous. He had something like 56 women that he dallied with, and those were just the ones who were of noble blood, according to, you know, whatever. The number was probably more like 77 if you didn't include all noble women. And so he had all of these children all over everywhere. And so they were talking about how he had legitimized some of his children. And I was like, this, I mean, because this is one of those things. I mean, you hear about bastards and Shakespeare, and the question of ancestry, I think, is really irrelevant here. It's like how, you know, what is legitimacy, right?
Well, the Roman emperors created heirs by adoption sometimes. I mean, usually they were relatives, but not like direct descendants. And it would reorder.
But anyway, so like Henry IV had legitimized sons, and I could talk about him all day because there's so many problematic things about what he was doing. So many. You know, I kept thinking, you know, what do you do when a person of awesome power comes to your door for your daughter? You know, I mean, anyway, but I don't want to go down that road right now. But I did think it was interesting in the you know, assuming somebody into your family line, adoption. But anyway, this idea that some of his offspring from other women could be somehow legitimized and be able to inherit things from him in the European context, I think was kind of interesting. Yeah, but
now we're talking about traditions of inheritance, though.
Well, that's true.
I mean, it's all interrelated, but
yeah.
The thing that I find interesting is, like, Pratchett likes to subvert everything, but I love how he subverted the divine right of kings.
Yeah.
In Discworld, because he has a character who one would assume would be the rightful king of Ankh-Morpork, and he completely eschews this. And there's also intimations that actually Nabi might have a better claim to the throne than Carrot does. And it's a lovely, sly thing he's done in there in the midst of living in a very intensely monarchist culture, and in the midst of, you know, Americans, we fought a war to not be subjects, and yet some of us are really, really intensely impassioned about the British royal family.
That's for
it's
sure.
An interesting thing we do. I mean, we don't obsess over anybody else's royals in nearly the same way. So
it's true.
But yeah, just the entire idea of just because your great grandfather, etc., was a thing, should you be the thing? And what do you do with ancestral trades when the world is in flux? That's a story that I haven't seen written a lot. I want to see the story of as the world is going from feudalism and those technologies are getting outmoded, what do you do? We tell these Renaissance stories about the inventors, but I actually want to know about, you know, essentially I want to know what happens if you come from a family of buggy whip makers. Because that's actually the story that we need to be exploring right now.
Yeah.
Very good point.
I'm writing the words buggy whip makers right now. My notes.
So one thing that besides inheriting money and culture and occupation, medical histories, because Cliff was talking about adoption as well. If you don't know your ancestry, sometimes it can make a huge difference.
Yeah, I have a story about that. Can I tell a story about that? My husband's father was adopted, and then he contracted colon cancer, which is highly genetic in its expression. And so, in fact, when he was diagnosed, he went searching for his biologically related siblings so that he could inform them. And in fact, he had to bring a lawsuit to allow the records to be opened.
Unsealed. Yeah.
Unsealed, there we go. To allow the records to be unsealed for this medical potentially life-threatening medical reason, which I thought was very interesting. And he ended up getting those records legally unsealed. And late in his life, when he was obviously coping with colon cancer, he was able to establish a relationship with his biological siblings and let them know that they were potentially at risk. So I thought that was a pretty interesting little bit.
The other story that I'm not seeing coming out yet that reflects modern technology is that we have a whole lot of drama happening in families all over the world based on genetic testing availability. And people finding out that their ancestry is not what they were told. I mean,
yes.
You know, I have somebody going, I've been told we're all Koreans, but wait a minute, I'm a quarter Japanese. What do you mean I'm a quarter Japanese? And all
yes.
these stories are coming out that are sort of imprinted on the genes, and we're not telling these stories yet.
Yeah.
Of what do you do? And I'm sure that right now it's coming out because of curiosity, but I can see stories of, oh, we needed to sequence your genes because you had some kind of disease and et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And then you find out that nothing you believed is real. And whether you do it as magical realism or urban fantasy or science fiction, there's an interesting story to be told there.
Yeah. I have to mention this. There's this really funny episode of 30 Rock where Tracy Jordan finds out he's related to Thomas Jefferson. And it sort of like shakes up his whole worldview for like that episode. And of course they did it for humor, but it was a pretty good episode. I mentioned that you can watch on Netflix.
Well, you know, it's funny how when, you know, hey, you found out you're related to X, and then the immediate assumption is that it must have some overweening significance to the meaning of your life, right? I mean, like,
yeah.
There
was. I just read the description for a book in a catalog about this a black woman who finds out her grandfather was I think it was that Nazi Ammon Goethe.
Oh yeah.
And she was like, and the book is called "My Grandfather Would Have Shot Me," and so it's like, you know, yeah, maybe you find out you're related to something awesome, but maybe you find out you're related to something fucking horrible too. And what do you do with that?
My husband likes to joke that one of my ancestors caused the Great Depression.
Okay, then.
He didn't.
Were they a Wall Street
contributed to it.
Oh.
Yeah. If you're curious, the guy's last name was Smoot. The Smoot Hollow Earth Act. Yeah. That was one of my ancestors.
Yeah. That's still better than
I know about Mormons. I'm related to quite a few of them.
Oh.
So I have a friend who has her family history traced back to the god Odin.
Wow.
That's a lot of tracking. And that would be one of the reasons, a reason to make sure going forward from there that you know who your children are, so they know where they came from.
You know, that actually does show up in fantasy, though, where you're like, you know, in demigods and like mythology, like demigods and stuff, like your dad is Zeus or something, you know?
Yep. Well, there, you know, you know what? Here's a piece that we haven't even touched on yet, and luckily we still have time. Naming conventions in Scandinavia are directly related to your most recent ancestor, or possibly in some contexts to a less recent ancestor, because some of those names just stick around and they're now passed down, but they don't change. And others of those names, depending on the community you're a part of, are literally determined by father's first name.
Yeah.
Right. And in fact, you've got you've got like Thorson, and if you're in Iceland, you get Thorsdottir.
Yeah.
Right. So that's worth talking about.
Yeah, so I have a former coworker who is of that, like, descent. He's American, but he's descended from there. And when they had twin sons, they had to figure out what they wanted to keep the last name. But what they did was they gave each son his first name as a middle name on the birth certificate.
Oh, that's interesting.
A way of Americanizing the tradition, but keeping the last name consistent so that the Americans are not freaking out. But in some way, you know, they're the sons of this guy, so that's what they did. So they both have the same, both twins have the same middle name.
Interesting.
Yeah, a lot of Russians are, as they've come
That's
to the
true.
U.S., are still keeping the patronymic as a middle name. But that nomenclature gets into a whole rabbit hole, and to anybody who's looking for that, there's a great document that's called something along the lines of it's scolding computer programmers for their assumptions about how names are constructed. I'll have to look it up.
Please do, because I'd love to put that in my report, Kat.
But it's you know, it talks about the fact that mononyms are common in other parts of the world, that we have this assumption that people have first names and family names and maybe private names, but that's not necessarily so, and that names that repeat are considered fake, but that kind of thing is common in some places where,
yeah,
you know, you might have somebody named a repetitious name because their name and their dad's name are the same or something.
Yep.
And also that people change their names throughout their lifetimes.
And middle names and
So,
initials
yeah,
are
names are a big thing, but I think that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother episode.
Well,
two
We
or
haven't done it
three.
already.
now on the list of topics.
Have we? I feel like, did we do naming before?
I think we have, but I think this
I thought we
takes
did.
us into some regions that we haven't visited before.
Okay. Yeah.
yeah.
So as far as Ancestry goes, I mean, we have a bunch of Ancestry based storylines, right? We have
Yep.
the birthright that was taken from me. We have rediscovering one's parentage. I need to go find my family.
Yep.
We have screw my family heritage. I'm going to go be me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure what other Ancestry tropes there are off the top of my head. But, I mean, I think the thing that's interesting is how often Americans are willing to reenact classist tropes because of Ancestry. Blackadder is very much about, like, I think that the thing that happens for people who live with that sort of centered is that they are more inclined to critique it. And I think I don't remember if it was Shea Morgan who mentioned this. I think, yes, as Americans, perhaps we are not inclined to critique it as much because we take it for granted that
Yeah.
a certain
And I think
amount
it's something we got from the
self-direction
British too.
Oh, we definitely got it from the British.
I blame Disney.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm,
It's implicated.
my children were taught as, my daughter especially, because I knew she was going to get a lot of princess culture, was told very young that no, you know, people believe that just because you were born a certain way, and princesses actually need to pay back to their communities, or you know, they get deposed. And I carefully didn't mention what exactly the mechanism of being deposed was like. Because there's a wide range.
Yeah, there is a wide
But
range.
yes,
That's one way of putting it.
We've talked about the fact that princess is not just about wear pretty dresses and do stuff.
Yeah.
That they are in fact supported by the labors of everybody below them. And we went to go see Aladdin which is kind of an ancestry story, I guess, and the Broadway staged version here locally. And you know, at intermission, my kid's really excited. Oh, it's really pretty. Who are your favorite characters? Oh, I really love the princess. She's really awesome. What do you like about her? Well, you know, pretty and all this stuff. And I'm like, where do you think they get their money from? And she just looks at me very puzzled. And I said, I'm sorry to inform you that kings have traditionally gotten their money from people poorer than them. She looked horrified. You're like, oh no! Sorry.
Those people are poorer than them for a reason.
Yes. So yes, Disney and the uncritical adoration of class. And also, you know, you look villainous, therefore you are a villain, and all the other things. So.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, we could have like a whole Disney topic.
Let's just bash Disney Day.
Well, no, it would be deconstruct Disney Day. That would be more alliterative too.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, we don't look at this. We don't look at this critically, and then we swallow things like Disney. And Disney has an easy time because it's selling fantasy and it's selling uncritical fantasy. But all those uncritical fantasies end up reinforcing a whole bunch of things that I would classify as social injustice. So
because a family has connections to a community. They sort of have to. You live in a world with other people, whether it's a close-knit community or an economic community. So the family has responsibilities to that community, and you know, the princess, the Disney princess culture says that responsibility is not part of the heritage, even though it is.
It's really weird, right? We have these very individualistic princesses who only care about their own welfare.
Yeah. But then, you know, going back to the occupation, if your family has been the buggy whip makers, and you decide you don't want to be one, and say you're in a place where this is still relevant, then do you have a responsibility not just to your family but to the community to be a buggy whip maker instead of going off and doing something else? Do you have to make sure that your position in the lineage is covered before you go off and do something else?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was actually just watching a show. There's this really interesting show put out by NHK about regions of Japan, and they had a little one of their episodes was about this region of Shikoku Island where there's this old set of cultural practices that they wanted to look at, and there was dancing, and it was very, very cool, but it was also, there was this undercurrent of sadness because a lot of the people who were learning it are foreigners or people studying it, and the young people have moved away. Right. And this is not something that's exclusive to Japan by any means. You know, the society changes and the kids decide that they're going to have to abandon what their parents did in order to keep going. Where's the balance there? But that's, I mean, again, another topic. Like I keep like making notes. Okay, this is a topic, and this is a topic. So, yeah.
I like something that Janet Kagan did in oh, I can't remember the name of her book. It's not Hellspark, it's the other one. The other one. But in her future skiffy setting, she had people who were living in these communities of affinity and like reenacting American Texans, and they were essentially the SCA, but for our contemporary cultures, and also cultures that we would have reenactors for, and sort of playing with the ways that they got things wrong subtly. But yeah, preservation of culture and knowledge, and as humans learn more and more, what do we do with all that stuff? I mean,
Yeah.
we're in a world of how did the Romans actually build their concrete? Because they did it better than we do.
Right.
So
Is it? Is that Maribel? Cat? I just looked it up.
what's that?
The book that is not Hellspark is Maribel, I think.
Mirabile?
Mirabile, yes.
Mirabile? Okay.
Mirabile, yes. It is in Mirabile. It is part of the world building of Mirabile.
That sounds interesting.
So a couple of thoughts. Oh, sorry.
Go on.
Just a couple of thoughts while the kid's quiet. Over here, it's more about descendants than ancestors today. So anyway,
Yeah.
there's two things that did non-human ancestry, which we haven't talked about really well.
Right.
There was the Barry B. Longyear novella Enemy Mine, which made it into a movie in which it becomes the human's responsibility to go to the lizard guy's homeworld and recite the ancestry of the baby as the parent, and that's the culmination. And that's all about the alien idea of ancestry and adopting the human was sort of adopted into the alien family, backwards, right?
Right.
Kind of by the baby. And then there's also very interesting, I've been reading the Descender comics, comic book series, which is about a robot, but the robot's ancestry is extremely important. In particular, the core operating system of this robot is related somehow to the core operating system. They call it a codex in the story of a bunch of giant killer robots. And this robot is in the shape of a little boy and is designed to be a companion to a little boy. And so his personality is, he's a kid, essentially, but he's related to the giant killer robots by ancestry somehow through the code. There's a code lineage there. Yeah. And everyone's after, he's the MacGuffin. He's both the main character and the MacGuffin. Everyone's trying to get a piece of him to figure out how to either stop or help these giant killer robots, depending on whose side you're on.
Well, so, okay, and so I also want to mention another story which problematizes ancestry in some really interesting ways. It's actually a series by Octavia Butler. They, the one that starts with Dawn.
Xenogenesis or later Lilith's Brood.
Lilith's Brood. Okay, so definitely that one.
Yeah, that's absolutely about ancestry and mixing with aliens.
Right, exactly, mixing with aliens and the consequences for of what happens when the ancestry of the humans doesn't matter to the aliens, and how that affects human societies, and oh my goodness, lots and lots and lots of stuff there.
Yeah, that was originally the Xenogenesis trilogy, but posthumously retitled by the publisher Lilith's Brood, which is how you find it now.
Yeah, I have two of them sitting up on my shelf right here, so I don't know where the other one went, but it's around here somewhere.
I think the Patternist series, which is now being released under what?
That too.
Gave it another title, and I don't remember.
And Kindred is all about ancestry, so I guess we can say Octavia was all about ancestry on some level, right?
Well, I think it's actually really hard to find a piece of genre fiction that does not at least take a stance on ancestry. I mean, some of it is more overt, and some of it is directly grappled with or subverted or whatever. But but ancestry is one of those things that is a big cultural undercurrent in our lives, and it takes a lot of different forms, and it's easy to find it slipping in under the radar if we're not paying attention to it, which is, I think, one of the reasons it's good to have a topic like this. So thank you, Morgan.
It's just your parents too. I mean, like in middle grade, it'll be like your parents or maybe your grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
But like there's a lot. There's this one series, the beastologist, and the boy's parents have disappeared, and he's being raised by his aunt, and his parents are the beastologist is just they you know, they have like, you know, unicorns and dragons and stuff, and they're like the caretakers of these animals, and they're fighting. There's like this other sort of like, either it's a different beastologist family or they're like, it's vaguely related. So like the villain is like some distant cousin from like a different branch of the family. You know, so you do have things like that show up in middle grade a lot.
Oh, tons. Tons.
Yeah. So
it would be very easy for us to just sort of say, hey, and, you know, here, pick a stack of books and figure out how Ancestry plays in each one of them. I'm sure there would be something.
I want to bring us in contradiction with my usual let me take us far afield habits. I want to bring us back to Ancestry and talk about why Octavia Butler is interested in Ancestry, and sort of talk about creator relationships to Ancestry, because it is one of the great scars of the transatlantic chattel slavery and abduction of Africans, that it broke, and deliberately broke, and as a means of violence and control, the continual breaking up until emancipation of people's ancestry and lineage awareness. And so it's not surprising that a lot of her fiction explores that the meanings of that beyond the this is my family, these are my cousins level. And that I am expecting that as we get more First Nations, Indigenous, Aboriginal people writing in genre, we will have other explorations of what ancestry and culture mean for us as humans, dealing with history and technology and aftermath. And so I think there's a difference between the monarchist lens on ancestry and the sort of enlightened and liberal look at ancestry, and then now there's a post-colonial lens on ancestry. So
well, we are running over you guys.
We started late.
But I think those are great thoughts to end on.
Yeah.
Honestly, I'm really glad you said it, and I didn't want to like stop you. So, but yes.
Well, and in non-genre, there's the Alex Haley Roots. Wasn't that like based on his research?
Yes.
Into
it was so big because it was all about your ancestry.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's a non-genre example.
Yep. Well, it's a huge topic, and I appreciate you guys all being here to take it on with me today. I'm really sorry that Kalita didn't find her way in, but she was going to be listening anyway, so so hopefully she'll be able to come in and chat with us another time. And I appreciate you all being here. I'm going to stop the broadcast.